So late last week, WWE put out a new documentary called WrestleMania 9 Becoming a Spectacle on Peacock. I did get a chance to watch the documentary over the weekend, and I want to give you my thoughts on this documentary. This is about WrestleMania 9, which was the first and previous WrestleMania to take place in Las Vegas. Of course, this weekend, WrestleMania 41 will also be in Vegas. Now, we knew, if you've been paying attention, like if you've really been paying attention, you knew that WWE had a ton of behind the scenes footage specifically from WrestleMania 9 because we saw a lot of it in the History of WrestleMania documentary. And a lot of this footage was basically shot by WWE in case someday they wanted to do a making of WrestleMania documentary. But the reason as to why it took them so long is because showing you the behind the scenes and the wrestlers being out of character in 1993, that was a no-go. Granted, yes, Vince McMahon had already told the Athletic Commission that wrestling was worked. There were still people out there in the early 90s who weren't really quite sure. And so it became a thing where there was a lot of footage shot, but never really thought they were going to do much with it. And that's unfortunate because I actually really wish there was more footage like this shot for other WrestleManias. To be honest, WWE didn't start making this a recurring thing until right around WrestleMania 19. If you remember, there was a documentary that came out hosted by Jesse the Body Ventura about WrestleMania 19. I think it was called The Mania of WrestleMania. And it was like this. Now, the reason as to why I find this special, for a few reasons. Number one, my favorite wrestler of all time is Bret the Hitman Hart. He's featured on this. I, have seen WrestleMania 9 a bunch of times. It was a very big show from my childhood, but not a very good show. A lot of folks consider it to be one of, if not the worst WrestleMania of all time. I think WrestleMania 11 is probably the worst of all time, but 9 is probably right up there in the top 3. It just wasn't that great of a show. And that's one thing the documentary sort of was threading the needle on. They weren't really bashing the show necessarily, but they weren't going to come out and say it wasn't a good show. They went into a lot of the behind the scenes stories, such as the return of Hulk Hogan, the status of Bret the Hitman Hart as champion, what he was told, and what didn't happen. Obviously, if you've done your research on this, whether it be by listening to Bruce Pritchard's podcast or Bret the Hitman Hart's book, because it is talked about there was a lot of behind the scenes, let's just call it differences between Hulk Hogan, Vince McMahon, and Bret Hart. That's briefly covered here. They do talk about Hogan getting into a jet skiing accident and getting a bruise on his face, and how there were rumors even in the back among the wrestlers that Randy Savage bruised him up, and that was the rumor, but that's not really what happened. So they did cover that. But what really fascinated me was focusing on just seeing the wrestlers and the talents from that era out of character. It's always weird to me to see a young Vince McMahon directing Traffic. It's not something that I have an issue hearing. It's fascinating because seeing him actually, and he was somewhat limited. There's probably a lot more footage of Vince they could have shown, but because of the scandal, they kept that to a minimum. But you saw some behind the scenes stuff with Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Hulk Hogan. And they interviewed guys like Lex Luger, Hulk Hogan, Shawn Michaels, and Bret. They were all featured here. A little bit with some other people, but those are the 4 wrestlers that I think really got the focus. I kind of wish that Bruce had said more. So they go over that. They go over kind of why Caesar's Palace was an important building. And they go over setting up the production for an outdoor WrestleMania. They talked about, because this is the first outdoor WrestleMania, they talked a lot about having the animals. Because you have to remember, and if you haven't seen WrestleMania 9, you wouldn't know, but WrestleMania 9 had a number of animals. You had camels, you had horses, you had elephants there. And so WWE had to bring in a team to handle all of that. And that's something that you really haven't seen since then. What WrestleMania can you think of that had like a living animal there? I remember even wrestling overall. I remember going to AEW All Out 2019 and Hangman Page came out riding a horse. Like, that's cool. But whenever you bring in an animal into a show that's very produced, obviously you may have some hiccups and you have to be very, very careful with it. We're talking about elephants, large animals. Somebody could have been hurt. There could have been a problem with the elephant hurting a fan. This was a risky thing. And for some reason, it sort of didn't really cross my mind until I watched this documentary just how risky it was to use animals. I mean, it really is something that something could have gone wrong. Thankfully, it didn't. They went over that. They went over the Hulk Hogan title change, which is funny because when I got on the internet and started reading the sheets, as they say, this finish was hated by a lot of wrestling fans, especially Bret Hart fans, because it was seen as Hulk Hogan playing politics and giving himself the title again. But I can tell you, as being a 9-year-old kid, 8-year-old kid actually, I will tell you that after this event, my third grade class was ecstatic that Hulk Hogan was WWF champion again. I'm not even kidding. Like, it's just funny how the perception of wrestling from, I would say in a way, somewhat snooty, somewhat jaded, but people who understand the business, in a different way, the sheet readers, and we still have this attitude to this day. They see wrestling different than like the kids do. Because as little kids, obviously I was sad that Bret wasn't champion again, but Hulk Hogan being champion again really did bring familiar, warm feelings of nostalgia to us as kids. And there were still a lot of Hulkamaniacs in '93, even though Hulkamania was past its prime. That was discussed. They had some interviews with DiBiase, some behind the scenes stuff. Really, the production stuff is what I found to be the most fascinating thing about this documentary. They really went through everything. It wasn't short. It was about 2 hours. And they go through, not really in detail, every match on the card, but they do comment on matches you wouldn't think of them to comment on, like the Steiner brothers versus the Head Shrinkers, which I thought was the best match on the show. That was a phenomenal tag team match. And then you've also got the Crush versus Matt Bourne match, which unfortunately with these types of documentaries, both those guys are no longer with us, so we can't get them to comment. But they talk about doing the multiple doinks illusion and all that. That was fun to see again. That stuff is just, I love heel Doink in '93. The first 8.5 months of Doink the Clown were some of the best character work that WWE had seen, and really kind of ahead of its time. Heel Doink was like a dark character. The Undertaker's also here, and they talk about, the issues working with Giant Gonzalez, the rehearsal. We see some rehearsal footage of him with that eagle that was next to him and how he was kind of intimidated by that whole thing. The crow or whatever. Again, more animals. He's not on here that much, but he is on here quite a bit. Again, a lot of people are no longer with us, like Randy Savage, Bobby the Brain Heenan. They couldn't comment on this. Scott Hall is no longer with us. Bob Backlund is, but he didn't comment. Bobby the Brain Heenan, Mean Gene Okerlund, they're no longer with us. Sean Mooney does have some, so there were some snippets of him on this. So it's just, I do wish this would have come out when they were alive. Obviously, there's a connection between this and this weekend because of the whole Vegas thing. And I really do wish that they put more documentaries out with some of this behind the scenes stuff. The WWE Vault YouTube channel has been releasing some stuff that has never before been seen. and that's damn cool if you ask me. So, yeah, if you want some nostalgia, like if you grew up in early 90s wrestling, or if you're curious about, what it was like to be at Hulk Hogan's last WrestleMania, also Bobby Heenan and Mean Gene's last WrestleMania, and yes, they did all come back later. I'm not saying they didn't, but after this, they would all be in WCW by the following year. A lot of folks would end up in WCW, Randy Savage too. So, you've got sort of the last WrestleMania where we're transitioning out of the rock and wrestling fully and into the new generation. This WrestleMania, to me, I think, is the first one of the quote unquote new generation WrestleManias, because Bret Hart is headlining against Yokozuna, who's also no longer with us. So they had to get Rikishi to talk about that, because Rikishi and Yoko were very close. Rikishi was on the show as well. He was Head Shrinker Fatu. So, anyways, check out the documentary. It's well edited and a lot of fun. A lot of fun to revisit those old days. But there's obviously more stories they could have told that they chose to stay away from. Anyways, those are my thoughts. Have a good one. I will see you real soon. Take care.